Hey everyone, welcome back to Scripture and Saga. I've got another presentation for you today. This time we're going to be taking a look at the Philistines from the Old Testament of the Bible, and specifically we'll be looking at what the Bible has to say about the Philistines, as well as what the wider history and archaeology can tell us to try and answer the question of who exactly were the Philistines and where exactly did they come from. So to kick things off for us, really, I just want to start by taking a look at the background for who the Philistines are, as well as the different names that the Philistines are known by, because it wasn't just the ancient Israelites who wrote about the Philistines in Hebrew. We actually have records of the Philistines from a number of different ancient civilizations, each one recording in their own language. So to kick things off with a brief background on the Philistines were an ancient people that lived on the southern coast of Canaan along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. They inhabited this region from the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, and geographically this means that they were situated to the southwest of the Kingdom of Israel as well as to the immediate northeast of Egypt. The Philistines inhabited in this region a confederation of 5 city-states. There were other cities to be sure, but there were 5 principal large population city-states. Collectively, this confederation of cities is referred to as Philistia, or land of the Philistines, but it's also sometimes referred to as the Pentapolis. Pentapolis is Greek, meaning 5 cities. So the 5 principal Philistine cities that were on the coast, and we can see 3 of them listed here in this map, they were Ashkelon, Gath, Ashdod, Ekron, and finally the city of Gaza. So the Philistines are most famously attested in the biblical narrative of the Old Testament. But what a lot of people don't really realize is that the Philistines are also mentioned outside of the Old Testament in other ancient documents or ancient inscriptions. And it is these extra biblical sources that may give us a hint as to who exactly the Philistines were and where they came from. So briefly to talk about the word Philistine, in Hebrew the name appears as Pelishtim, while in the Greek Septuagint, which the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures, the name appears as in 2 different forms actually. So the first form, which is more rare, is Philisteim, which is fairly close to what the Hebrew gives us. But 9 times out of 10 in the Septuagint, when the Philistines are mentioned, they're not called the Philistines. They're actually called alophiloi in Greek, which means other nations or those of other nations. So it seems like the Hebrew translators that were responsible for compiling the Septuagint made an interpretive decision when, like I said, a majority of the time that Philistine is mentioned in the Greek, it's not the word Philistine. They made an interpretive decision to actually translate it as other nations, which I think really plays into the depiction or description of the Philistines as really being outsiders. They're not native to this area in southern Canaan. They came from afar. They're not supposed to be here. They are, in a sense, in the way that the Bible describes them, they are intruders, really. So just to dive a little bit further down the Philistine name rabbit hole, as I said before, in Hebrew the name appears as Pelishtim. In the Greek Septuagint we see it rarely within the Pentateuch and the book of Joshua as Philisteim, but more commonly throughout the rest of the Septuagint the name appears as alophiloi, which is other nations. Now the name also appears in the Akkadian cuneiform script, which was the lingua franca of the Near East at the time. So places like Babylon, Sumeria, and Assyria, even down into Egypt to an extent, Akkadian was spoken, or at least it was used in diplomatic correspondence with kings sending letters to one another. So in the Akkadian cuneiform script, the Philistine name has 3 different forms that we know of. They're known as the Palastu, the Pilishti, and the Pilistu. And then lastly, the modern term Palestine to refer to the land of southern Canaan, especially on the coast of the Mediterranean, and the demonym Palestinian to refer to a person who lives in Palestine. Both of these terms are widely believed to have derived from one or perhaps multiple of these ancient names for the Philistines. So I'd like to take a look at what the biblical narrative specifically has to say about the Philistines before we jump into any of the extra biblical historical sources for them. So jumping headfirst into the biblical narrative, in the Bible we have the Table of Nations, or sometimes it's called the Generations of Noah, and this comes to us in Genesis chapter 10. So Genesis 10 lists 70 different nations that the ancient Israelites were aware of, and it also lists the patristic origins of those nations going all the way back to Noah after the Great Flood. So for the Philistines, what we're interested in particular is Genesis 10 verses 13 and 14, because this passage lists the Philistines as descending from a people that the Bible calls the Kasluim. And the Kasluim themselves are said to be descended from Mizraim, which is the Hebrew term for the land of Egypt. So while Mizraim is easily identifiable with Egypt, the identity of the Kasluim people, or the Kasluites, if you will, is still a matter of debate. Most theories place the Kasluim on the island of Crete, along with the Caphtorim, while others suggest that they actually originated from either Western Egypt or perhaps Eastern Libya. There are fringe theories, though, that actually suggest that the Kasluim came from Kolkis on the Black Sea coast of the modern country of Georgia. But on the right here, we can see an illustration of the Table of Nations from Genesis chapter 10. You'll notice in the yellow shaded area in Northeast Africa that we can see the Kasluim listed immediately to the west of the Nile Delta. And we can also see the Caphtorim listed on the island of Crete. As we will see later, the association of the Philistines with the coast or with islands in the sea is actually pretty significant. For now, though, just note the proximity of both the Kasluim and the Caphtorim to the land of Canaan immediately to the east. So continuing with the biblical narrative, the Philistines are mentioned numerous times in the Old Testament of the Bible, especially in the books of Judges and Samuel. So here are some of the highlights from the biblical narrative about the Philistines. But of course, anyone who's read the Old Testament knows that this is by no means an exhaustive list. So in Genesis chapter 21, there's a man named Abimelech, which is actually a Hebrew name, so probably not what Abimelech actually called himself, but Abimelech is a name that means my father is king. But regardless, Abimelech is presented as some kind of Philistine ruler with his own army and captain of the host. Abraham enters into a covenant with Abimelech at the site of Beersheba, and Abraham's son Isaac deals similarly with Abimelech later in Genesis chapter 26. In Judges chapter 13, we see God deliver Israel into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. And this is, of course, part of the Judges cycle, so this happened because of Israel's impiety to God. So this leads to the rise of the judge Samson, who is famous for his immense physical strength. And Samson, of course, had very violent encounters with the Philistines, including killing 1,000 of them with nothing but the jawbone of a dead donkey. In 1 Samuel chapter 5, the Philistines finally managed to capture the Ark of the Covenant after the Israelites had tried to use it as a weapon on the battlefield. But due to curses that seem to fall on anyone who possesses the ark, they actually end up passing it around to several of their cities inside the Pentapolis before they finally decide that enough is enough and we need to give it back to the Israelites. One of the more famous events from that chapter is the supernatural destruction of the statue of Dagon, who is said to have been one of the Philistines' gods, when they placed the ark in the temple of Dagon. Also, in the book of 1 Samuel, we learn that the Philistines oppressed the Israelites to such a degree that they actually did not permit the Israelites to make weapons of war. So no swords, no spears, and the Israelites actually had to get their tools, like farm tools, sharpened by Philistine metalsmiths in 1 Samuel 13. Then in chapter 17, of course, the famous giant Goliath that David slays is from the Philistine city of Gath, one of the main cities of the Pentapolis. Interestingly, in the book of Amos, God says that he brought the Philistines from Caphtor, just as he brought the Israelites from Egypt. Then in Jeremiah chapter 47, there is mention of the Philistines as being, quote, remnants from Caphtor. And of course, Caphtor is the ancient Hebrew term referring to the island of Crete. Now, recall from Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations, that both the Caphtorim and the Casluim are descended from Mizraim, Egypt. So there's an affiliation with both of these peoples that the Philistines are said to come from. We have an affiliation of both of them with the land of Egypt. So the Philistines, in a way, are also affiliated with the land of Egypt. Since Caphtor is identified with the island of Crete, we can also see, like I said before, a growing association between the Philistines and the ocean, or the islands of the sea. So overall, the Philistines in the Bible are presented as being one of the chief enemies of Israel, alongside other nations like the Moabites and the Ammonites, until they are mostly subdued under the reign of King David. And ultimately, the Philistines really disappear from the historical record, at least as a distinct cultural entity, after the Assyrian conquest of Canaan in the 720s BC. So it's likely that what happened to the Philistines at the end of their story was the same as what happened to the 10 northern tribes of Israel, which is to say the Assyrians came in, conquered everything, and then exiled the population to different parts of the Assyrian Empire. So before we move away from scripture itself and into archaeology, what are the key takeaways on the Philistines from the biblical narrative? So firstly, the Bible says that the Philistines came to the Levant, or the land of Canaan, from elsewhere, namely from the Casluim in Genesis chapter 10, and from Caphtor, or Crete, in both Amos and Jeremiah. Next, and perhaps most obviously, the Philistines are a violent and warlike people in the biblical narrative that are, outside of perhaps a few limited instances in Genesis, like with Abimelech and Abraham, they are pretty much always hostile to the Israelites. The Philistines are pagan, as we see with the mention of their god Dagon, and they do not recognize the God of Israel. And lastly, the Philistines controlled a region in the southern Levant that we call Philistia, and this region consisted of 5 primary city-states, again called the Pentapolis. So pictured on the right is a map of the southern Levant from the early Iron Age, and prior to the capture of Jerusalem by King David. Note that the 5 cities of the Philistines are here, as well as the red arrows, which actually mark the biblical recordings of Philistine incursions or invasions into the land of the Israelites. So in particular, the valley between Azekah and Succoth here was actually mentioned as the location for David's confrontation with Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Moving away from scripture and into the extra biblical sources now, we're going to be jumping into one of my personal favorite historical topics, which is the Bronze Age. So we're going to look at what the Bronze Age is, how it ended, and how, in my opinion, it provided the perfect setup for the rise of the Philistines in the land of Canaan. So let's take a step back and talk about the Bronze Age, which is the historical period that precipitated the rise of the Philistines in Canaan, but it also precipitated the rise of the Israelites in the Promised Land. So the Bronze Age refers to the time period of both the Mediterranean region and the Near East. So practically everything from Italy in the west all the way to Iran or even Afghanistan in the east. This time period ranges from about 3000 BC to 1100 BC. And it's called the Bronze Age because in all those centuries in this region, the dominant material for metalworking was bronze. Everyone used bronze to make weapons, to make tools, to make armor, to make household or palace decorations, and in some cases it was even used in construction. So bronze is an alloy, and it's made up of both copper and tin, with tin itself being a relatively rare metal, especially back then, with very few known tin mines during this period. So the Bronze Age is marked by a number of advanced kingdoms and empires that spanned the entire Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. The major players on the geopolitical board at the time are going to be the Mycenaean Greeks on the Greek mainland, as well as the Hittite Empire in Turkey, the Mitanni Empire that spans from Turkey into Syria and Mesopotamia. We also, of course, have the Canaanites in the land of Canaan along the Mediterranean coast. We have the Assyrian Empire over in northern Iraq. We also have the Babylonian Empire in southern Iraq. We have the Elamites in what is today Iran. And probably most importantly, as we're about to see in the presentation, we have the New Kingdom of Egypt in the northeast corner of Africa. So given the importance of bronze for metalworking and construction and whatnot, as well as the rarity of its materials, again with tin being a very rare metal back then, all of these kingdoms, nations, empires, they all went to very great lengths to secure a steady supply of bronze. You could think of essentially for all of these empires, bronze was to them what oil is to us today. Of course, this usually meant wars or alliances between the different nations and empires. Alliances could typically be secured through diplomatic marriages. The Egyptian pharaohs in particular were very fond of marrying foreign wives to secure alliances. All the empires engaged in trade with whatever goods were in demand, meaning that the entire region's economy was effectively globalized, so that the economic well-being of any one nation depended on the economic well-being of the other nations around them. It was also a deeply interconnected world. Everyone knew someone. The king of Greece might not know the king of Babylon, but he probably knew the king of the Hittites, and then the Hittite king would know the king of Babylon. So you're only 2 or 3 social links away from knowing everybody that's involved in this world. The Bronze Age is also the time period of several well-known developments and events. This is the time period that saw the invention of writing, first over in southern Iraq among the Sumerians, which is actually the region where Abraham comes from in Genesis chapter 11 or chapter 12. So we have the invention of writing, we have the invention of advanced mathematics, we have the invention of astrology over in Mesopotamia, and we have the first instance of grand architecture in human history. So we have the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, and of course we have the famous Great Pyramids of Egypt. So there are also some famous names from this time period. Hammurabi of Babylon. You might remember learning about Hammurabi in school and his law code, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We also have Ramesses II of Egypt, one of Egypt's greatest conquerors alongside Pharaoh Thutmose III. Not to mention the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, which is considered to be the first advanced civilization in European history. But in terms of biblical chronology, everything from Abraham to the Judges period takes place in the Bronze Age. and this is also the setting for the legendary Trojan War. So the Bronze Age was preceded by the Copper Age, where, as the name implies, the dominant material for tools and weapons was copper, and the Bronze Age is succeeded by the Iron Age, which everyone used iron to make everything. But as we're about to see, and it does relate directly to the Philistines, the Bronze Age ended, but it did not end peacefully. So just to give a little more context for the Bronze Age in this region, here's a map of the major kingdoms and empires near the end of the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean. So from left to right, starting off in red, we have the Mycenaean Greek civilization, which conquered the much older Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. This is actually the Greek civilization that existed at the time that the city of Troy fell. So if the Trojan War actually happened, these would have been the Greeks that actually did it. In orange, we have the Arzawa Confederation, which was actually a loose collection of city-states that included the ancient city of Troy, which here is listed as Wilusa in northwestern Turkey. Wilusa is the ancient Hittite name for the city of Troy, whereas the ancient Greeks actually called it Wilion. In green, we have the Hittite Empire as well as its vassal states. Just below that, we have the kingdom of Alashia on the island of Cyprus in yellow. The island of Cyprus was actually a very big exporter of copper metal at this time. And in fact, the name Cyprus is actually Greek, Kupros, and Kupros is Greek for copper. In purple, to the south of that, there is New Kingdom Egypt, which was the most prosperous and powerful age in Egyptian history. In blue, there is the kingdom of Mitanni, which would eventually be conquered by the Hittites and the Assyrians. In darker green, we can see Babylon, and finally we have the Elamites in dark pink in modern-day Iran. So, as I said before, all of these empires were engaged in wars and alliances, trade deals, and diplomatic marriages with one another throughout the centuries. As we can see, at this time, the land of southern Canaan was under the domain of New Kingdom Egypt, including pretty much all of what would eventually come to be called the Promised Land for the Israelites. And northern Canaan is controlled by the Mitanni, though eventually the Hittites are going to, as I said, the Hittites and the Assyrians, they conquer the Mitanni. Mitanni's holdings in the land of Canaan eventually are taken by the Hittites, and the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire actually come to blows for territory in the Levant. Now, on a somewhat funny tangent, allegedly there is a clay tablet from around about 1750 BC that tells us about King Hammurabi of Babylon receiving a pair of sandals from Kaftor, or the island of Crete. That is already a very long distance to send a pair of shoes, and hopefully this illustrates for everyone the great lengths of these ancient trade routes and the fact that there was a regular exchange of gifts between kings and emperors throughout the region. But Hammurabi, for some reason, decided to actually return the shoes all the way back to Crete, and we're not really sure why. Maybe they didn't fit, or maybe they were just so last millennium, but you wouldn't know it from Hammurabi's law code, but evidently he had a little bit of pettiness to him. You know that saying, man makes plans and God laughs? Well, that's the case with the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age came to an end in what we call the Bronze Age collapse, or sometimes the late Bronze Age collapse. So this was a sudden, violent, and mysterious series of events that took place throughout the 12th century BC and led to a Mediterranean and Near East world that was very, very different from the one before, essentially a new world order. So the Hittite Empire collapsed. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and Elam all lost a majority of their territory. Assyria in particular, as well as Babylon, came very near to total collapse themselves. And all of these, except for Assyria, would never again be as powerful as they once were. Assyria is the only one that was going to rise after the collapse and become a new superpower to dominate the region. The destruction and withdrawal of both Egypt and the Hittite Empire meant that the Canaanites that were in between them in the land of Canaan were freed from vassal status for the first time in centuries. So because of the collapse, as I said before on the map with the previous slide, Egypt and the Hittites would eventually control basically northern and southern Canaan in between them. Well, with the collapse, the Hittite Empire is gone, so northern Canaan is freed from their control. Egypt ends up withdrawing from Canaan and losing a bunch of territory, so now southern Canaan is free from Egyptian control. So now the Canaanites are freed up from being vassals for the first time in hundreds of years. Lastly, as part of the Bronze Age collapse, Greece saw the destruction and abandonment of many of its cities and palaces, and it entered a time period that we call the Greek Dark Ages. During the Greek Dark Ages, pottery designs became very, very primitive. Pottery had been a relatively advanced design, as well as one of the chief exports of Bronze Age Greece. But going into the Dark Ages, pottery actually regressed and became much more simplistic in design. Grand architecture in Greece was halted. No new, big palace or city construction projects. And most importantly, the art of writing was completely lost in Greece. There's a 400-year period in Greece where nothing apparently was written down. So a 400-year gap in the historical timeline of ancient Greece because of the Bronze Age collapse. So regarding the collapse, scholars have long debated and speculated the exact causes for everything, why so many nations appear to have collapsed and essentially disappeared within the span of about a century. So to go over some of the proposed causes that have been put forward by scholars over the years, there's ironworking, right? We're at the Bronze Age, we are going into the Iron Age. Perhaps there were certain people groups that developed iron weapons earlier than everyone else and subsequently overran the established kingdoms. If you know anything about metalworking, you know that bronze, while bronze itself is sturdier than copper, and the Copper Age came before the Bronze Age, bronze itself is actually very soft and weak compared to iron. Iron is the superior metal for creating tools, weapons, armor, but iron has a much higher smelting point, so you need a much, much hotter furnace to melt iron down and fashion it into tools or weapons or armor or what have you. So what if a certain people group actually came into the region or was already living in the region and developed iron first, developed widespread iron working first, and then use that to conquer some or one or two of these kingdoms. Earthquakes also seem to have contributed to the destruction of several cities, most notably the city of Troy, or as the Hittites called it, Wilusa. In some regions, there is geographical evidence of serious drought at this time, and drought obviously would have resulted in crop failure, so food shortages. That's going to lead into famine for certain people. Famine leads to malnutrition. Malnutrition 9 times out of 10 breeds disease. So disease may have also been a partial cause for the collapse. Although from all the historical documents that we have of the time period, of all these kingdoms and empires writing about basically everything falling apart, there is no mention of disease, but it seems like it should be there. As mentioned, the balance of this world order was maintained by the network of trade routes, especially the flow of bronze, as well as other necessary trade goods. So you can imagine in a globalized economy like this, if anything happens to jeopardize those trade routes, it places further strain on all of these established kingdoms. And lastly, and as we are about to explore on the next slide, there are records of invasions and population migrations along the coast of the Mediterranean. The nations of the Bronze Age likely could have survived any one of these factors, but when all of them combine together, it creates what is basically the perfect storm to topple any nation. That brings us at last to the topic of the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples are a mysterious group of seafaring peoples that appear in Bronze Age inscriptions just before as well as during the collapse. So from the records that we have of the Sea Peoples, which, by the way, the written records of these people span from Syria all the way down to Egypt, possibly also from the Greek city of Pylos in southern Greece. The Sea Peoples seem to have raided or otherwise plundered a host of cities along the Mediterranean coast across a couple generations worth of time. They attempted 2 of these raiding attacks on the land of Egypt, the first one being in 1207 BC under Pharaoh Merneptah, and the second one being around about 1177 BC during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III. So the Sea Peoples were known to the Egyptians prior to this time. Some of them had actually been encountered by Merneptah's father, Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, at the Battle of Kadesh in Syria, where this was one of the battles between Egypt and the Hittites for control of Canaanite territory. And at this battle, Ramesses II records that some of the Sea Peoples were serving as mercenaries in the army of the Hittites. So when they were initially discovered in Egyptian records, the Sea Peoples were hypothesized to have been the direct cause of the Bronze Age collapse. As in, all the nations that collapsed, it was all because of the Sea Peoples and their invasions, their piracy, their raiding. But more recent research has actually led specialists to speculate that the Sea Peoples were as much a symptom of the collapse as they were a cause of it. So, as I said before, the Sea Peoples account for the migrations and the invasions of this time period, but empires were felled by invasions combined with drought, famine, disease, and the collapse of the international trading networks. But here on the screen, we can see a, I think, pretty decent artistic depiction of the Sea Peoples. You can imagine them disembarking from their vessel right here, landing on the shores of Egypt, ready to try and raid and make a new home for themselves. So the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III ruled Egypt from roughly 1186 to 1155 BC, and ultimately he died in an assassination plot. But he is considered to be the last great warrior pharaoh of Bronze Age Egypt, and his mortuary temple is located at a place called Medinet Habu, and it contains inscriptions that describe his 2 different military encounters with the Sea Peoples. So here we can see a photo of the entrance to the temple, and then we can see below that, we can see one of the battle inscriptions against the Sea People. And then over in the bottom left here, I've got a tracing of that same inscription just so it's easier to make out some of the details there. But in the inscription here, we can see the pharaoh himself being depicted as like a godlike figure, larger than life. He's so much taller, he towers over everybody, typical of Egyptian art. Immediately to the left, though, we can see the naval invasion of the Sea Peoples. And it is depicted as being a very, very chaotic scene. There's ships piled one on top of the other. We have Egyptians storming the vessels and fighting on the ships themselves. We have people falling out of the ships. Along the bottom of the inscription, we can see the Egyptian soldiers actually leading away the Sea Peoples as captives because the invasion was actually a failure on their part. So Ramesses III actually encountered the Sea Peoples in battle twice. First at the Battle of Jair, which was actually a major land battle in 1180 BC. And according to Ramesses, this was a decisive Egyptian victory. It was fought against the Sea Peoples in the land of Canaan. But this was not the last time that Ramesses would have to deal with the Sea Peoples, these Bronze Age maritime marauders, if you will. Just a few years later, in 1177 BC, Ramesses fought off another army of Sea Peoples, this time coming from the actual sea. And this time, of course, it's a naval battle. We have ships of the Sea Peoples trying to land in Egypt. We have the Pharaoh's ships that are meeting them on the Nile River in the Nile Delta region. And what follows is Ramesses III's own inscription from Medinet Habu regarding this naval battle. And to do Ramesses III justice, I'm just going to read this directly as he has it. So, the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their isles. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at once. A camp was set up in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Peliset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Dinyan, and Weshesh, lands united. They laid their hands upon the land as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting, our plans will succeed. So, note from this inscription some of the names that Ramesses gives us. So firstly, we have some lands mentioned, right? So we have Hatti, Kode, and Arzawa. All of these are in Turkey. Hatti itself actually refers to the land of the Hittites. And Ramesses gives these lands as having already fallen to the Sea Peoples. We also see Carchemish mentioned, which is in Syria. Alashia, again, is a kingdom on the island of Cyprus. The enemy, or the Sea Peoples, came against Egypt from a camp set up in Amuru, which means that they launched their invasion from a camp in the land of Canaan. Canaan, at the time, was associated with a people group that the Bible calls the Amorites. The Egyptians called them the Amuru. They seem to have been a dominant ethnic group in Canaan at the time, so Ramesses is referring to Canaan as the land of Amuru here. Most importantly, though, as we're about to get into, Ramesses gives us the names of the 5 Sea Peoples tribes that were part of the army. So the Sea Peoples were actually a confederation of multiple tribes of people, all of them seemingly working together to try and raid Egypt here. So we have the Peliset, the Jeker or Tajeker, we have the Shekelesh, we have the Dinyan, and we have the Weshesh. These names may actually help us to understand who these people were and where they came from. So across all ancient sources regarding the Sea Peoples, of which Ramesses III is only one ancient source, there are 9 total tribes that are associated with this Sea Peoples label, right? There are 9 tribes that are in one way or another affiliated with this act of going around the Mediterranean and being essentially swords for hire or raiders pillaging cities. So, first of all, the Shekelesh. The Shekelesh fought for Libya against Egypt in the time of Pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled before Ramesses III. And the Hittite records also mention the Shekelesh, but they refer to them as the Shikalayu. Now, because of linguistic similarities, archaeologists tend to associate the Shekelesh with the island of Sicily, but it is actually unknown if the Shekelesh came from Sicily, or if maybe after the Bronze Age collapse, they went to Sicily, and maybe that's how the island got its name. The Shurdan tribe fought for the Hittites against Ramesses II, Merneptah's father, and are called the Shirtanu in Akkadian records. This tribe possibly came from the island of Sardinia, which again is based on the linguistics of their name. The Weshesh are a Sea People tribe that are only mentioned by Ramesses III, with no known description of their appearance. This makes them probably the most mysterious of the Sea People tribes. There are fringe theories about where the Weshesh came from, but we really don't have anything concrete, and of course nobody is really sure what they looked like. The Tejeker are also attested in the Egyptian story of Wenamun, where they are actually present in the land of Phoenicia in northern Canaan. The Tejeker are possibly affiliated with the island of Crete in this time period, because the story of Wenamun, which places them in Phoenicia, takes place in and was written down after the Bronze Age collapse, in the time where most civilizations had already gone into a dark age and Egypt had shrank in both territory and in influence. The Ekwesh and the Dinyan tribes are both typically affiliated with the Greeks of Homer. So you think about the Iliad and the Odyssey that were written by the ancient Greek poet Homer. Ekwesh are typically associated with Homer's Achaeans. So if you think about, like I said, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer uses several different labels, several different demonyms or people names to refer to the Greeks. He calls them the Achaeans, he calls them the Argives, and he calls them the Danaans, right? Well, in Greek, Achaeans is actually Achaewoi, and so because of Achaewoi sounding somewhat similar to Ekwesh, they believe that Ekwesh are Greeks from Bronze Age Greece. And then, of course, we have the tribe of the Dinyan. As I said, one of Homer's demonyms for the Greeks is the Danaans, or in Greek, the Danaoi. So it's believed that the Dinyan and Homer's Danaans are also one and the same. And so because of this, both the Ekwesh and the Dinyan are theorized to have come from either mainland Greece or perhaps the Greek islands in the Aegean Sea. Finally, and most importantly to us, because this presentation is about the Philistines after all, we have the Peliset. The Peliset, as you can probably hear in the name, are tied to the Hebrew word Pelishtim, and are almost universally recognized by scholars as being the biblical Philistines. So there are two other tribes that are not mentioned by Ramesses III. First of all, we have the Luca. The Luca are easily identifiable with the ancient region of Lycia, which was in southwestern Turkey. And actually, in the story of the Trojan War, the region of Lycia is listed as an ally of the city of Troy. And then we have the tribe of the Karkia, which are also theorized to have come from western Turkey. But not much is known from them, from the other inscriptions. So there's actually a papyrus document called Papyrus Harris I. It's named after the collector that acquired it in 1855. It was found near Medinet Habu, and it's the longest known papyrus from ancient Egypt. And it actually contains, among other things, a summary of the entire reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, including how he defeated certain enemies of Egypt and resettled them as Egyptian subjects. So he defeated the Libyans and the Meshwesh and resettled them in the western Nile Delta as Egyptian vassals. But importantly for our discussion, it also relates how he defeated the Peliset and then resettled them in southern Canaan to the east of Egypt to essentially act as guards on Egypt's eastern border. And then here on the right, we can see an inscription from Ramesses' temple at Medinet Habu, where we see some of the sea peoples arriving in Egypt with children as well as with ox carts pulling their possessions. So this suggests that there were not just pirates among the sea peoples or among the Peliset, but also entire households and families that were on the move, likely fleeing from the collapsing civilizations in the Aegean Sea region. So if this account is accurate, as it is believed to be so by most scholars, then this provides us the answer for how the Peliset moved from the Aegean Sea down into Egypt, and then from Egypt into Canaan, and eventually came to be known as the Philistines by the ancient Israelites. So as it turns out, there may be other, quote, evidence for the sea peoples originating in Greece, or at least the Aegean Sea region. Recall that Ramesses III said that the foreign nations made a conspiracy, quote, in their isles, or in their islands, to give another translation, and that the Ekwesh and the Dinyan Sea People tribes are tentatively identified by scholars as Achaeans and Danaans in Homer. So in the Iliad by Homer, which recounts a mythologized view of the final year of the war at Troy, several books mention Greek raids in other areas of the Mediterranean, particularly those that were allied with Troy. And in the context of the story, these raids were carried out so that the Greek army could maintain war readiness as well as obtain a steady flow of supplies and food for the army that was besieging Troy. But also in Homer's Odyssey, books 14 and 17 both mention a failed Greek raid on Egypt when Odysseus lies to other characters about his origins. He actually tells people in those two books of the Odyssey that he set sail from Crete. So the question is, could these Homeric accounts actually be evidence of the ancient Greeks retaining a cultural but perhaps mythologized memory of the events of the Bronze Age collapse? So to do justice to what I'm talking about with Homer's Odyssey, I'm going to read a little excerpt here from book 14 of the Odyssey. So the context here is that Odysseus has just made it back home to Ithaca, and he's actually speaking to his swineherd Eumaeus, but Odysseus is in the disguise of an old beggar, a homeless man. And Eumaeus asks him who he is and where he comes from, and Odysseus tells him a lie that he is from Crete, containing this excerpt. But then the spirit within me urged me to make an expedition to Egypt. I appointed 9 ships, and rapidly the people were gathered. On the 7th day we went aboard, and from wide Crete sailed on a north wind. On the 5th day we reached the abundant stream Aegyptos, and I stayed my oar-swept ships inside the Aegyptos river. But they, following their own impulse and giving way to marauding violence, suddenly began plundering the Egyptians' beautiful fields, and carried off the women and innocent children, and killed the men, and soon the outcry came to the city. There they, the Egyptians, they killed many of us with the sharp bronze, and others they led away alive to work for them in forced labor. So, with this in mind from the Odyssey, is this perhaps Homer inserting a Greek cultural memory of the failed raid or multiple raids against the land of Egypt during the Bronze Age collapse? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's fun to speculate. So throughout everything that we've seen so far, there is a noticeable affiliation of the sea peoples and islands, right? And of course, both from the Bible and from the Homeric sources, if you can call Homer a source on this subject, it seems like the Peliset, or the Philistines, might have come from the island of Crete. So I want to take just a second here and focus on Crete in particular to talk about its wider history in the Bronze Age. So the island of Crete was known by several ancient names, including Kerete in Mycenaean Greek. Ancient Hebrew calls it Kaftor. Ancient Egyptian sources call it Keftiu, and Akkadian calls it Kaptara. The island was home to the Minoan civilization, which flourished from the start of the Bronze Age until the end of the Bronze Age, and is actually recognized as being the first advanced civilization in European history. Their written language was called Linear A and is glyphic, but is still undeciphered to this day. The Minoans had a maritime empire built on trade and the exporting of goods, as well as labor, and Minoan artists and architects were employed all around the Mediterranean, helping to build Greek palaces as well as decorating the Egyptian ones. The Minoans were conquered by the Mycenaean Greek civilization around about 1450 BC, which marked the start of their decline. And it's likely that the Peliset arose on the island of Crete from this mixing of both Mycenaean and declining Minoan culture, since, recall, the biblical account gives Caphtor as an origin place for the Philistines, and of course, as I said in Homer, we have a mention from Odysseus of a raid on Egypt from the island of Crete. On the right here, we have 3 images, and for the sake of these images, I had to remove the camera feed for this slide. But the first one that we have is the Phaistos disc, which is an example of Minoan glyphic writing that is still undeciphered to this day. It was recovered from the island of Crete. And below that, we have an illustration of the primary Minoan palace at Knossos on Crete. Recall from Greek mythology, if you're familiar, Knossos was the palace of the Cretan king, King Minos, who is indirectly responsible for the Minotaur. The Minoan palaces were huge by ancient standards, and they contained a lot of rooms and corridors and even open courtyards. The Minoans were also really big fans of bulls for unknown reasons, but there have been many different depictions of bulls in paintings, in pottery, in bronze sculptures, and in little figurines found at Minoan sites. So it's generally believed that this bull affiliation, combined with the maze-like design of their palaces, served as the historical inspiration behind the story of the Minotaur and the labyrinth in Greek mythology. But all of this is to say that if the paliset really did come from the island of Crete, this is the historical and cultural background that created them. So, where does all of this leave us? Keep in mind, the late Bronze Age and all of its civilizations and circumstances is still a matter of scholarly speculation, especially regarding the collapse. So some pieces in this puzzle appear to be too convenient, while others may see them as being a little too contrived. But even with that, I think we can still sketch out at least a loose timeline of events to try and answer the question of who were the Philistines. So, to recap and to give the timeline, firstly, the late Bronze Age in the Mediterranean saw a number of empires and kingdoms that flourished for centuries with international trade. You had diplomatic marriages and the occasional war. But due to multiple factors, some of them being environmental factors, many of these civilizations collapsed in the 12th century BC. And it is during that same time period that the Sea Peoples appear and start raiding or settling in the eastern Mediterranean. They attack Egypt multiple times, culminating in 2 attempted invasions under Pharaoh Ramesses III. These invasions include multiple tribes of Sea Peoples, including the Paliset, who appear to have sailed from Greece or perhaps from the island of Crete itself. Ramesses III defeats them and resettles them in southern Canaan as Egyptian vassals. Now that they are in southern Canaan, the Paliset Sea People settle and quickly intermarry with the native Canaanite population, creating the Philistine culture as kind of a hybrid of both Aegean and Canaanite religion, pottery, architecture, etc. So from here, anyone who has read the Old Testament knows that the Philistines served as both a snare and a threat to the people of Israel, even oppressing them greatly at times, until the entire region is conquered by the Assyrians around 720 BC, at which point, as I said, the Philistines largely disappear from the historical record, and we can consider that to be the end of their story. So finally, we arrive at the end of this presentation. But right here at the end, I wanted to say that I personally find the Bronze Age and the Bronze Age collapse to be very fascinating historical topics. So I wanted to recommend a couple of books on the topic for further reading, just in case anyone watching this is interested. Both of these books are written by Dr. Eric Cline, who is a historian, an archaeologist, and a professor of classics at George Washington University. And he's written both of these books. I think they're both very excellent, covering the collapse and its aftermath. So the first book here is called 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. And this one's really good, covering the build-up to and the process of the collapse. While the second book, called After 1177 BC, covers the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse and the birth of the new civilizations that arose from the ashes of the Bronze Age world order. Also in the description of this video, I will link one of Cline's presentations that covers the collapse in much greater detail than I was able to do so here, if anyone's interested in seeing that. This is not a sponsored video or anything. I just think that Cline is a very excellent source for info on this topic. But that's all I have for now. So I want to thank everyone for watching, and I hope you learned something, if not about the Philistines, then at least about the Bronze Age, and I'll see you in the next one.